quiet on the set.
In 1980, former movie actor Ronald Reagan swept his way to the presidency, beating incumbent Jimmy Carter in 44 states. Coming on the heels of the bad news-laden Carter administration, Reagan's flag-draped conservative rhetoric had a strong popular appeal.
Ronald Reagan was indeed that patriotic, did indeed have that view of America as something out of a 1930s movie.
Number 40, Ronald Reagan, Republican, 1981 to 1989, 69 years old, from California. So far, Ronald Reagan is the oldest president ever to be elected, and even to those who served on his staff, he's one of the most unlikely.
I always assumed that the brightest person made the best leader. And Reagan was not the brightest person in the country, but he was a terrific leader.
Reagan enjoyed his time in the Oval Office, whether feeding the White House squirrels or sharing a weekly Mexican lunch with Vice President George Bush. Reagan's First Lady, Nancy, had great influence over him, sometimes planning his appointments based on advice from her astrologer. President Reagan had few close friends, but he was well liked in Washington.
He was the life of the party, and the person he was likely to enjoy most would be the one with the most new dirty jokes.
A nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. I'm speaking to you tonight.
Known as the great communicator, Reagan knew how to strike just the right chord in times of crisis.
Nuclear destruction. The defining Reagan moment for me was the Challenger disaster.
Challenger, go with throttle.
Ronald Reagan exhibited that quality that I call the chief soother.
We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them, this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye, and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God.
Even when he faced down the bullet of a would-be assassin, Reagan projected a calm that reassured the country.
When I saw all those doctors surround me, too, I said I hope they were all Republicans.
It was that humor when he was shot that I think endeared people to Reagan and also gave them a sense, this is a strong, tough fellow. I think it was the transforming moment in his presidency.
Ronald Reagan's management style reflected his Hollywood training. He was the star, and it was up to the rest of the crew to keep the production running smoothly. This led to the perception that he was a puppet.
He was certainly not a puppet. He made all the decisions. He could be disengaged from the details of policy.
Reagan was also rumored to fall asleep in cabinet meetings.
The suggestion that he went to sleep in cabinet meetings is ludicrous. I've got a wonderful doodle out here that he did that says, "Dear Jim, you see, I don't sleep in all the cabinet meetings. Sometimes I do this." And so he was able to poke fun at himself.
But Reagan's lax management style may have led to the darkest episode of his presidency, the Iran-Contra affair. Reagan denied knowledge of the illegal scheme that funded anti-communist rebels in Nicaragua with proceeds from covert arms sales to Iran. With most presidents, such a claim would seem far-fetched, but in Reagan's case, it was entirely plausible that he was out of the loop.
There were a lot of people at that time, particularly in the National Security Council, who were going around, running around doing things that I'm quite confident the president didn't know about.
In the end, Reagan avoided criminal charges in the Iran-Contra affair, although he did accept responsibility. Sort of.
A few months ago, I told the American people I did not trade arms for hostages. My heart and my best intentions still tell me that's true, but the facts and the evidence tell me it is not.
While he was forced to backpedal on Iran-Contra, Reagan never wavered from his core beliefs.
Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
Reagan had an almost religious devotion to shrinking the size of government, building up the military, and lowering taxes. His economic plan led to a boom in the 80s and record deficits in the 90s.
Reaganomics is built on the theory that you don't have to worry about the future. You can cut taxes, you can raise spending, you can raise defense spending, and ultimately you don't have to worry.
Of course, you've got huge deficits, but Reagan was doing this philosophically. He wasn't doing this as an economist.
Enough Americans believed in the rightness of Reagan's policies that he was re-elected overwhelmingly in 1984. In his campaign that year, he trumpeted the return of domestic prosperity, declaring it was morning in America.
It was a lot of rhetoric. It's the notion that you wave the flag and celebrate American virtues and turn a blind eye to failings.
Overlooked in Reagan's rosy view of America were issues like AIDS, women's rights, and homelessness.
It's understandable with Reagan because he doesn't believe in using government for social engineering.
But the cornerstone of Reagan's legacy, and any claim he might have on presidential greatness, is the notion that his leadership won the Cold War for America.
They are the focus of evil in the modern world.
The struggle to contain and then stop the spread of Soviet communism begins, of course, with Harry Truman and goes through all of the presidents. But what Ronald Reagan does is he makes it into a moral thing. He says, this is an evil empire. It's going to collapse.
Communism is another sad, bizarre chapter in human history whose last pages even now are being written.
Using his strong rhetoric as political cover, Reagan was able to take a softer approach with his Soviet counterpart when the opportunity presented itself.
Reagan, to his credit, sees that in Gorbachev, he has someone he can negotiate with. And Reagan seizes upon that. They have 4 summit conferences, summit meetings, and this does move the Soviet Union along the road toward the collapse, which occurs in 1989, 1990.
When Reagan went to Geneva for the first of his summits with Gorbachev, aides were worried that the president would be overmatched by the more detail-oriented Soviet leader. Gorbachev, a former engineer, was reputed to be a master of the intricacies of geopolitics and weapons systems.
But they became fast friends. They met in Geneva, 4 hours of talks. And I finally got the nerve up to ask Reagan one time at a little private dinner. I said, you know, you weren't a detail man. I said, how'd this happen? I remember Reagan looked at me and said, oh, Hugh, he said, he didn't know any of that stuff either.
In 1983, Reagan unveiled what was to be one of the most bizarre presidential initiatives of all time.
Let me share with you a vision of the future which offers hope. It is that we embark on a program to counter the awesome Soviet missile threat with measures that are defensive.
The Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, was largely a product of Reagan's own imagination.
It would stop missiles in outer space so they couldn't hit our house.
Well, I have to tell you, SDI, the so-called Star Wars initiative, was a shock to most of us on the White House staff. We never saw it coming. And it was Reagan being Reagan. It was something he wanted to do, and he didn't want to staff it out.
Although dismissed by most as impractical, it now appears that the Soviets took SDI seriously. Suffering from internal economic problems, Gorbachev knew he couldn't keep up with an arms race in space.
Whatever one thinks about the military merits of it, I think it was a masterstroke diplomatically. It was at that point that the Soviets came to the realization, we can't compete with this. We can't keep up in the arms race. And I think that SDI, in retrospect, hastened the end of the Cold War.
During a 1987 visit to the divided city of Berlin, Reagan put an exclamation point on his rhetorical war against Soviet communism.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
I thought it was a joke. I never expected that this daring statement, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, would have any effect. It was just simply rhetoric, words playing to the audience. But then it happened.